Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Humans podcast. Today with me in the show, we have a very special guest from ServiceNow, Ben Sigelman. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
No, pleasure. Can you introduce yourself a bit and tell us about yourself?
Oh, my least favorite topic about myself. So I'm Ben. I've been working in and around observability as a discipline for a long time. I'm somewhat shocked to say that it's almost half of my life. I'm in my mid-40s. I joined Google right out of college in 2003, and then spent a couple of years working on ad stuff, which I really didn't enjoy, and then kind of fell into this trap of trying to solve the observability problem. And I'm both happy and sad to say I'm nowhere close to solving it, but it's been really fun. So I've been working on this more or less continuously for a really long time. So that's mostly what I've been doing. I did start a company in 2015, Lightstep, which kind of found its original kind of initial traction doing tracing stuff before kind of broadening out to more of a full platform observability thing. And then along the way, realized that there were a lot of problems with standardization of getting data out of systems. So I had a lot to do with the creation of OpenTracing and then OpenTelemetry, where I spent a portion of my time ever since. So that's kind of the short version. Lightstep was acquired by ServiceNow about 3 years ago, and so at ServiceNow I've been running the observability business and then also helping out with their strategy around cloud and cloud native stuff in general.
Okay, I think, that's like a super interesting story. Maybe let's start in the beginning, like Google 2003, how many people maybe? And how did you come from ads to observability? Like, doesn't sound like or it does? Like, does it make sense? So maybe share a bit about the beginning.
It doesn't make sense to answer your question, but it was a good thing, I think. So yeah, 2003, Google at that point, it was less than a year before they went public, but so it wasn't totally clear to the rest of the world. Google still seemed like this magic new search engine. It was less than 5 years old as a company, but internally they realized that they were going to make a pile of money before I was hired. And there was very much a difference between people who were hired before and after that in terms of, equity and stuff like that. But it was still early. I was probably employee, roughly 1,000 plus, give or take. So, not so small that everyone knew each other, but small enough that that if you wanted to talk to someone, you could just ask and they would talk to you. So it was really interesting. And Google was, really, aside from the first year and a half or so, spent that early period of its life during the dot-com crash, which I think presented some challenges, but one of the best things about it was that they were able to hire an enormous number of incredibly qualified people who were coming out of these computer science research labs that were all folding at that time. So they took some of the best people from DEC's lab, which, DEC sounds like a dinosaur now, but at the time that lab was world-class, as well as from HP and a bunch of other organizations, Microsoft Research. They took a bunch of people from there. And these people were just kind of running around, not just fixing code, but really designing things in a way that a researcher would design them. And this is a segue into how I ended up leaving the ads world. So I did not like my job when I joined Google. I was incredibly naive to just make that concrete. When it was my first day, I'd actually never worked in the tech industry. And in fact, I'd never even had an office job. I'd worked at an ice cream store and I did a bunch of music stuff in the summers prior to that in college. So I joined, I had no idea what was going on. And my tech lead, who wasn't even my manager, was sitting next to me, and it was like 10:45 in the morning, and I really had to go pee. And I just asked him, like, Andrew, can I go to the bathroom? And he's like, yes, and never ask that ever again. Like, you do not need to ask me to go to the bathroom. Like, I didn't know anything, and I thought Google was this shining beacon of progress. At the time, its brand was just like a diamond, and then I was working in the bowels of the ad system, and as a kind of, overly progressive 20-something, I didn't really believe in advertising as a business model. And I thought it was, whatever, I won't go on that tangent, but I was not pleased. And then they had this thing where they set you up for a meeting with someone who was, it was optional, but for those who opted in, they put you in I think like a 15 or 20 dimensional vector space where the vectors were things like your office location, what languages you programmed in, how long you'd been out of school, which is sort of a proxy for age, a bunch of other stuff. And they just set up a 30-minute meeting with no context between you and the person is literally the furthest from you in this 15-dimensional vector space. And that was it. So I did it. And the person they set me up with was this woman, Sharon Pearl, who was one of these distinguished researchers who'd come out of I think she was at DEC Research Lab, but it doesn't matter. And she'd been at Google for a while at that point and was so smart and so qualified and was doing, she asked me what I was doing and seemed to be, genuinely very interested. And I was like, I don't like what I'm doing. What are you doing? And then she told me she was working on 4 or 5 different projects, all of which were actually pretty interesting, including kind of like a blob store, which at the time was a very weird concept, kind of like an S3 type of thing. She was working on a bunch of caching stuff. And then she rattled off this list. And one of the things was this prototype of a distributed tracing system that she'd built with this guy, Mike Burrows, and Dick Seitz, both of whom are also just phenomenal world-class engineers. And it didn't really work, but she described what it did. It followed transactions as they flowed through Google systems with no effort from the developer. And then you could reconstitute those transactions and look at them after the fact. And I thought that was so interesting and way, way more interesting than what I was doing. And at the time, my manager had 120 direct reports. I don't mean that was his org, but he literally had 120 directs, which is to say he had no clue what any of us were doing. And I was just like, I am going to work on that. So I started working on that instead, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. And that was, I don't know, I guess that was late 2004, early 2005 or something like that. I'd been at Google for less than 2 years. And then I did at some point formally say, listen, I really want to go and work on this. And I give Google credit for being a very flexible bottom-up organization at the time and essentially said, great, do it. So that's what happened.
I will say, like today, like telemetry, OpenTracing is like, everyone is like, yeah, sure, you should, you're building your service, you should bake it into. Back then, was there like, I'll be honest, it's before my time as like an engineer, like a real engineer. So what, like, was it groundbreaking? Were there existing tools in like other places? Maybe you can share a bit about, was it interesting to trace like a request back then?
It was definitely interesting at Google. It was absolutely not something that was you could expect to exist. I mean, let's remember that at that point, GitHub hadn't been founded yet. None of this stuff it was just a very different environment, right? And I think it was possible at Google because they were forced to basically clean room an entire stack, right? Like the only thing they really used was Linux, and the rest of it was just user space code that they wrote themselves. There's almost nothing that they used aside from some compression libraries and stuff like that were kind of quote unquote off the shelf open source, because that just wasn't really that doesn't mean the same thing now that it did then. There certainly was open source software, but it wasn't like a stack that you could install by any stretch. So yeah, it was very unusual. I think most people who are trying to do, significant computing at the time would go and buy some, pretty expensive, high quality machine from Sun running Solaris or something like that. And then if you needed more capacity, you just bought a bigger machine. And that was kind of the game, right? And those machines were incredible and very reliable, but especially compared to the kind of garbage commodity hardware we used at Google with Linux. But Google's, I think this is well known, but the model was just to build reliable systems from very unreliable hardware, and just have lots of them and make it all redundant at the software layer in user space. So Google was doing that themselves, and that created these very distributed systems because the individual components weren't really meant to be very reliable. So there's a lot of redundancy, which meant a lot of distribution of compute. So it was a different environment for sure than what was happening around them. I don't want to make it sound like Google is so smart and so sophisticated that no one else could have thought of this. It's not a very complicated idea, at least, to explain in a sentence, but it is a difficult thing to do in practice if the software ecosystem wasn't designed for it. And so I think other companies, when they hit that wall later on, a few years down the line, I think it was difficult for them to do it. Google got really lucky. Again, going back to these really distinguished people who came in early, they just built their systems in a way to allow for things like this. Like the initial instrumentation for Dapper was a couple of 100 lines of code, and that gave us coverage of many, many layers of the software stack. I still remember deploying it in production, and Google Web Search was between the user and the kind of bottom layer of that stack there were 10 to 15 layers of software that you had to go through. So yeah, absolutely, tracing was incredibly helpful in that environment. I would say downright necessary, actually. So yeah, it was really valuable, and it didn't take any convincing that this was important, but it was something that I think Google hit that wall before others because of their approach to building software.
Oh, no, that's super interesting. And now let's do maybe like a fast forward. You're leaving Google, but why? But why and how? And yeah.
That was that was a long time. I was there for almost 10 years. It's, nothing profound, I would say. It's a long time, right? I'm a mortal person, and I want to have different experiences. So most of it was just, I felt like I was still learning things from a day-to-day standpoint here and there, but it did sort of feel like every time I took on a new project, whether it might take a couple of years, but the projects started to feel very similar to the previous project in terms of the technology and the people and stuff like that. And I just felt like I was kind of in a rinse and repeat. And I think if I had been 58 years old, I absolutely would have stayed at Google. But at the time I was still pretty young, and I just felt like, look, I'm going to leave eventually. I don't want to do this for the rest of my career. So maybe I'll just leave now. So I left and started an incredibly unsuccessful social media company. Actually, that's what I did right after Google. I had these grand aspirations about working in consumer. I'm glad to say that I've been cured of that disease. I have no interest in ever working on consumer ever again in my entire life. I think it's important, but it's not for me. But out of the ashes of that, I was like, I just want to do something that I know is valuable. And so I got back into observability. So I guess I lied in the beginning. There was a little period in the middle where I tried to do something for mobile phones for people who were just bored, but that I don't think was a good idea.
I will say from consumer, and now we are talking with me from like a ServiceNow convention in Las Vegas, right? So I will say like quite a big of our turnout. So why did you why Lightstep? Maybe if you can like first of all like share what you guys did, but also a bit about the ecosystem back then. Because again, I think now when you think about APMs and tracing, it's like, oh yeah, obviously it's like the most like, I don't know, like it makes total sense. But I think when you founded the company, it really wasn't that ecosystem. So if you can like share about the company, about the ecosystem, what was your vision and how did it progress?
Sure. The vision for the company was actually pretty coherent and unchanging for the lifetime of the company. It was just that, look, if you look at applications that are going to actually make a difference in the world and create a lot of commercial activity and so on and so forth, there's going to be a race to move quickly on those applications because of capitalism. And in order to do that, people are going to hire a lot of engineers to work on these. And I have a belief that the only way to get engineers to be efficient when you have more than a couple of dozen of them is to divide them into small teams that can work autonomously. And that's really what leads you to things like microservices and Kubernetes and stuff like that. So I had a very strong belief that basic architecture of having separately deployable pieces that talk to each other, I don't care what you call it, I had a very strong belief that was going to happen. At the time, it wasn't completely obvious that Kubernetes was going to win. Actually, when we started Lightstep, Kubernetes definitely existed and KubeCon was a thing, but it was still kind of nascent and was competing with Mesos and a few other things. And it wasn't like a bet on Kubernetes exactly, but it was a bet on that architecture and that way of working. And then I knew from working at Google that if you were going to work on a system like that, you needed to have something like tracing. I mean, it was just necessary. It wasn't necessarily clear how we were going to get there, but I knew that was going to be needed. And so we just wanted to work on that problem initially. And so I think that was all true. And initially, I think our timing was just impeccable, which is a fluke. I actually thought we were several years earlier than we should have been, and I was prepared to wait for a long time. I remember telling our initial investors that I was going to keep the burn like really, really, really low, even if it meant it took us 5 years to spend this first round, because I don't want to be too early. But it turns out we were right on time, so that was lucky. Of course, the trouble with startups is that as soon as you have a good idea, people take notice, and we had an enormous amount of competition, really early, and that just stuck around, and that's always been the case in this
Is
market.
it like
So,
Datadog, New Relic was on your time, before you, after you? Did they do the same? Did they do the same? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would say most of the major kind of quote unquote APM providers. So at that time in 2015, that was like New Relic. AppDynamics is still a private company that was executing really well. Dynatrace actually seemed like it was going to be a dinosaur and living in private equity. I give them a huge amount of credit, the leadership at that company, to take something into private equity and like really reinvest in the technology and not just kind of bleed the customers dry and like come out of it the other side doing something really innovative. So, there are companies like that. So those were all around, and I think they all thought about things like tracing, but they'd built their architecture around, single process kind of, 3-tier architecture servers that had an agent. Like that was their model. So it was a little bit trickier for them. Datadog was very problematic for us. I don't need to go in. I mean, I'm happy if you want to go into the ins and outs of the competitive landscape in 2015. Honeycomb started about the same time as we did. I consider them friends. I mean, I guess we compete with each other, but we've always, I think, had similar interests. It's, in a startup, you have to be careful not to treat your competitors as enemies. Like in many cases, you're both trying to make a market happen faster, and it's not a winner take all market, which is great. So, I almost saw them as allies, but yeah, there are a few other folks around too, but I think we were right. It's easy. I mean, it's impossible to succeed in a startup if you aren't right about the market. Even if you are right about the market, it's still hard to succeed because they're competitors. I think we were right on about the market, and I think that we did a lot of things well from an execution standpoint as well. The decision to join ServiceNow at the time felt a little bit difficult. Like it's just hard as a founder to sell your company. Although in retrospect, I'm really glad that we did that. It's been interesting here. ServiceNow as a company, I think mainly is perceived as a place where you go to like request a new laptop or something if you work at a giant corporation. But in fact, they're doing a really large business and doing a lot of things for what I would call kind of the old guard of operations. And in some cases, it's now being called SRE at that scale too. But when you start talking with really large like financial services organizations and things like that, there's a regulatory need to have a truly centralized operations team, and the way that team interacts with like a cloud native platform engineering SRE organization is still pretty broken, honestly, and very interesting. The problems that we're solving, I think, have a lot to do with the kind of fundamentals of SLOs and MTTR and things like that, and less to do with like distributed tracing per se. But I actually think it's really interesting. So I've enjoyed this period as well for the last couple of years, but I've been more focused on trying to kind of de-silo our customers via software, if that makes sense. And it's less about like, oh, how do we add this new feature to OTel or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not been my focus for the last couple of years.
So maybe like a couple of questions. Like let's go back to like before the acquisition. What, maybe like share a bit about like which kind of persona was your target persona, and also like was it like to the platform or whatever, like the buyer persona. But also, if I'm a platform engineer, right? Like, and I have my own like Kubernetes stack, right? Why do I need something like that? And is it only for me, or like were your target like the broader organization? Should a developer use you guys? Is it only for the platform team or operation team? So if you can maybe like share with me the different persona that were your like end users back then. I think like now it's also quite the same, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think over the years, I've always believed, and I still believe actually pretty strongly, that this type of infrastructure, observability infrastructure, should be in the loop for a lot of personas. I mean, certainly including devs and stuff like that, but also customer success and financial operations and all sorts of other stuff. And there are proof points of how that can work. I think the reason that's been challenging to execute on, not just for us, but for many other competitors, is just it comes back to just buyers and how customers like to buy software. It's difficult to get. I mean, I'm just making this up, but it's difficult to get the director of SRE or a VP of SRE and a customer service manager to like collaborate on a purchase, and like ultimately if you're delivering value to both of them and you want to charge them for it, that would be necessary. So I think a lot of the issues fundamentally have to do more with go-to-market than product technology. But we've had customers over the years in many, many different roles. They've had people who benefit from what we're doing if they're willing to spend the time to make that happen and integrate it. But it is a difficult thing to sell a single product that touches on those personas unless you're part of a genuine actual platform. And there are some platforms like that. I mean, I think that's part of what the part of the appeal of ServiceNow, but it's hard as a startup to like offer that kind of platform breadth
Right.
and keep a straight face when you're trying to sell. Because we were, to answer your question, selling. I mean, the organizations, differ in what they call them, but it was whatever engineering leader was responsible for production. Basically, sometimes that was a VP of engineering, sometimes it was something of SRE, sometimes it was something of platform engineering. I mean, it differed, but that was their job, is the executive who was in charge of the reliability of customer-facing, revenue-generating software systems. That was the person that we needed to talk with. And then the users were mostly like the bread and butter user for Lightstep standalone was always someone who, among other things, was on call sometimes. Like they didn't always use this on call, but they had that role. So sometimes that they also were developers, sometimes they weren't, but that was the user persona.
No, I think like that's super interesting. And maybe what's your like philosophy? Like, we hear a lot of different opinions here on the podcast. Like, how much should like the end user developer that writes feature, right? Like he get paid for like writing new features, right? How much time should he spend in like an ideal world in a tool, like in an observability tool? Is it supposed to be like, I don't know, 5% of his time, 10%, never, always? Like, what's your take here about like where should we go as an industry, or like from a philosophy standpoint?
That's a good question. I am not someone who has a particularly rigid opinion about that one. People have definitely asked me that before, and I'm still somewhat flexible. I can see how it makes sense either way. I will say that I don't think that a dev should be, when you say quote unquote spending time in an observability tool, what I'm imagining is looking at some really large dashboard with lots of little squiggly lines and stuff like that.
How you do it? Yeah.
Right. That's this gets at one of my my concern about observability. And to be honest, like when we started the company, I didn't want to call Lightstep an observability tool. I don't like that term. I find it is too general to actually be meaningful. And if you look at the definition of observability from like a control system standpoint, it could be used to describe almost any beneficial tool that like is read only. It could be observability for finance or security or whatever, and indeed that's what's happened in the market. Observability has now gotten kind of washed out as a marketing term to mean all sorts of different things. So when people say it, I think they mean different things. You mean, I think, a big dashboard of squiggly lines. I don't think a dev should be spending much time doing that. But like, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if when you're looking in your editor, you could just see annotated over the lines of code, like what's happening in production vis-a-vis that code. Like, oh, this little section of code is like very high variance in terms of performance. Did you know that? Like, there's all sorts of things that could be built into the tooling that a developer needs to use that could actually be very helpful for them. And I've seen demos over the years of just almost magical things that have happened when we've built observability way, way, way left into developer tools, including IDEs. I think it's really cool. The reason it's been hard to deploy is just like dumb technology maturity and deployment stuff. But I would love to see that. But I don't know if that counts as observability,
Yeah, I'll say like two things. The first one, before like founding Commodore, I worked in a startup named Lookout that was acquired by them.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And we did like, what I did back then, I was the first developer, and I also write like the ID plugin, like the JetBrains plugin to Lookout back then. I would say there's like a lot of technology challenges which were like super hard to solve, but we managed to solve most of them. There is a mentality issue or like a cultural issue. Like developer, a lot of them, not all of them, right, don't think in production. Like they like in their head, production is like some beast that is too far away from them. And sometimes, I was able to show them relevant logs line from production, and like they're like, what? Where are you bringing like this data from? And I'm like, I don't know, like it's your application running somewhere, I don't know, like on the cloud. And I would say there's like a lot of technological like issues but also a lot around the culture. And it feels like a certain type of developers, which are usually like very strong and smart and so on. But for the vast majority, I think there still need to be more education. When we founded Commodore, like I did founded Commodore, we did try to think about what would the developer need to have in his like observability tool or like in his tooling when it comes to solve a problem in production, or when he's trying to understand his like or her system in production. And again, like even this vary quite a lot, but it's a question of both the technology and the culture. And I do feel that from a cultural standpoint, at least the shift left movement is very strong. I do see it. I think like when you founded the company, it was way too soon for developer empowerment and whatever, because I think the market was not ready yet. At least, with the rise of IDP, Backstage, Dev in the Focus, DevX, seems like, at least from my point, like much more predominant. Like, do you see the same thing? I wonder.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you reminded me, first of all, I didn't know you were at Rookout. Rookout was a really interesting product. I loved it for what it's worth. So thank you for making that. That was actually one of the things I was thinking of when I said I've seen some really cool stuff. As far as developers being the ones carrying pagers, I mean, I think what you're saying is true, that a lot of devs, I mean, some devs are just amazing and, they think about the whole system and the customer and the software and all of it and how it fits together, and they really care and they get it. There definitely are people who, for whether it's a lack of training or a lack of engagement, I don't know, they just don't. And so like that is a thing. And I think forcing people to be on call is one way to address that issue. So it's like, well, now you care about it, right? So that kind of makes sense to me. This is the thing that I don't like about that model. I think that solves a lot of problems for, if you think of software in general as just being this, this giant like mass of, some giant fruit or something like that, where it's like the very outside edge of it is like still growing out, and then the inside just kind of stays there, and you just want to make sure it doesn't rot. That outside edge is always growing, and that's where developers are spending their time. They're like building more and more software outside of this thing, and then the inside needs to stay healthy. And this is what doesn't make sense to me. Almost all software that we depend on is not really being maintained. Like most of it is the interior of that fruit. You do need to make sure that it doesn't rot. And so like, I'm sure there's sort of software as like there's a software engineer as part of the immune system of like going in and kind of maintaining things a little bit. But like, do we really want to have, do we think it's realistic for there to be people who are like maintainer ops, not DevOps, but maintainer ops? Because like most of the software is in maintenance mode, and that software can still break. Like obviously it breaks less frequently because it's not changing as much, but it can still break. And it just seems unrealistic to me, especially if you think about how the stuff projects forward. I think the DevOps thing works much better for applications that are still relatively young, and you still have a lot of people who have to make cross-cutting changes. But once software matures into legacy software, which is an absolute guarantee for any piece of software, I just don't totally get it, because like a lot of the software that can still break isn't being actively developed. So that's the part where I get kind of confused. So it seems like at the very least, there's going to be a need for people who are basically barely developers and mostly just trying to understand and maintain the system from a production standpoint. So the DevOps thing where people are carrying pagers might work, but it can't be the full solution. Or if it is, I wouldn't call that a developer. That's my critique. But
that's super interesting. So we almost ran out of time. Maybe now share a bit about like, a bit more about like why did ServiceNow acquire you? Like maybe let's deep dive a bit into that, and what are the current challenges of ServiceNow in the observability space, or like in the dev, like again, like I know ServiceNow. When I saw the acquisition, I was like, what? Like did I misread or something like that? So maybe like to share a bit about that, and also about what the future has both for ServiceNow in that space, but in general for maybe like the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thesis for the acquisition with Lightstep was there are a couple of angles on it. One of them is just observability is a big market. ServiceNow wasn't really in it, and now that they are, I mean, that there's that take on it. I think the more interesting one though, and the one that I found a lot more motivating, and to be honest, we had a number of opportunities to sell the company over the years, and I didn't, mainly because that type of thinking, I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but it's just not that exciting to me. The thing that I thought was more interesting, I will admit, even in the recorded podcast, and I say this with love to the people who run the brand at ServiceNow, who I think are actually very good. There is a perception problem around ServiceNow. I think that they got so big selling ITSM software that it'll be decades for them to help the world realize that that's not the only thing that they do. But that is definitely the perception. And ServiceNow does in fact do a lot of other things, and the stuff that ServiceNow is doing for these, I'm particularly interested in how ServiceNow interacts in more highly regulated markets from a customer standpoint, because those are the markets where, again, there's a need to have a truly integrated story across the new and the old. Because I don't actually think there's really such a thing as a cloud native application at like a giant bank. There are cloud native services, but those services depend on a bunch of very not cloud native, very legacy software that often runs on-prem and is maintained by people who don't even know how to write code. And how does that all fit together? Well, it's a mess is sort of the short answer. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. And ServiceNow has built incredibly large businesses by basically trying to create some rigor and structure in areas that are very messy. And this is a very messy area. So the thing to me that's interesting is how do you use signals from observability, which is to say, what's actually happening in production, not just to like add observability dashboards to ServiceNow platform, and we've done that, but more like how to use that data to actually give people some kind of common system of record across these different personas and different organizations and almost like different technology generations. And that's what I've found kind of interesting. Because I think with Lightstep as a startup, as we got bigger and started to work with more big enterprise software systems, we would hit this kind of like event horizon where you'd get outside of the Kubernetes ecosystem, and suddenly there are these dependencies that are very real and very painful and break a lot, but we kind of couldn't see them. Like they're outside of our purview in a very literal way. So it was either, okay, well, let's just go and build an integration for like all of legacy software, which as a startup wasn't really very attractive, or find a way to solve for the actual business problems, which mostly have to do with incident response and velocity, and solve for those as part of a larger, more integrated platform that actually is partnered with many of our competitors, which is necessary actually to solve this problem as well. So that's kind of what excited me about it, and I think what excited ServiceNow. I don't want to speak for the folks that sponsored the acquisition, but I think that's what we've been focused on.
Okay, so like last question, like the future, like what does the future has store both for ServiceNow and for like Kubernetes or the ecosystem? And we have like 1 minute.
I don't know if I can sum that one up, but I will say I just alluded to a big piece of it. I think that we're getting to a point where Kubernetes-based systems need to take the blinders off and acknowledge that the rest of the technology ecosystem also needs to be integrated in some way. And I think integrating the old and the new is really tough, but I think that's, at least from where I sit and the people I talk with, that's what feels most urgent.
Okay, sounds good. So Ben, it was really a pleasure having you here on the show. Enjoy Las Vegas, enjoy like ServiceNow in the conference, and hope to talk again soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.